From the very beginning, the presence of God is embedded in the fabric of Scripture. Woven from the first strands in the story of creation to the very last page. From Eden to eternity, from the rebellion to the redemption, from the clouds of Sinai to the crown of Calvary, the presence of God is an inextricable thread in the story of worship. In the book of Genesis, we find the Creator speaking creation into being with His divine voice, breathing life in that existence, and then creation chasing after. We see the Spirit of God, His very presence, hovered over the unformed waters of the earth, His presence present there from the start. As the narrative of creation continues to unfold, we are told that God would walk in the garden in the cool of the day in Genesis 3:8. Eden as a whole is a historical illustration of what life on earth looks like when unbroken communion with God and His presence takes place. Can you imagine what it would be like to worship God without limitations, unfettered, zero hindrance, completely free? Believe it or not, people once had this privilege. 2 people to be exact, Adam and Eve. In the Garden of Eden, before what is known as the fall, where sin entered the world, it's likely that God walking through the garden was a regular occurrence. The Hebrew in Genesis 3:8 indicates that these occurrences were habitual. It can even be inferred that Adam and Eve enjoyed these walks with God. Walking with God, what a thought. Imagine the conversation, the wonder, the intimacy, the awe, the presence, the worship. It is stunning how different Adam and Eve's worship of God would have looked from ours. It would have been uninterrupted by distraction, untarred by sin, their communion with Him unbroken. This is how the very concept of worship gets its name. In the time before Adam and Eve sinned and fractured this beautiful communion with the presence of God, they experienced this perfect unity with Him. However, due to this fracture, it was no longer within humanity's privilege and right to approach God freely, to eat from the tree of life, to walk and talk with Him in the garden. Although this lifestyle of worship became tragically lost, God always has a plan. As the story of Scripture and worship progresses, we encounter moments of awe and wonder where God would make Himself and His presence distinctly known. Moments like the burning bush that drew Moses near, or the pillar of cloud and fire that led Israelites through the wilderness. We see physical places and material manifestations where the tangible presence of God was revealed to people. In things like the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle or the Temple of God, sacred spaces where the presence of the Lord dwelt among God's people. Take your shoes off, you are standing on holy ground. In fact, the first person said to have been filled with the Spirit of God was Bezalel, an artist, a craftsman, a creative for the tabernacle, the place of worship. In all this, we see that the Spirit or the presence of God has always been directly connected to worship. But why an ark and a tabernacle? Why a temple? After all, Scripture makes statements exclaiming that God's presence fills the entire universe. One of David's famous psalms says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." So why would God want to use physical things like an ark, a tabernacle, a temple to reveal His presence? The simple answer is that these were for our sake, not for His. After the Exodus, God gave Moses detailed orders to build the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. He even gave the entire blueprint for how this should be done, right down to the color of the curtains and the measurements of the altar. He did this with specificity because the tabernacle existed as a reflection of Eden, the place where God's presence dwelt uninhibited on earth. However, God also gave a blueprint that was not only divinely aesthetic, it was divinely practical, because it was the tangible way for God's people to rightly interact with Him. In all relationships, there are spoken and unspoken, learned and unlearned rules to live by. These certain boundaries and commitments help relationships to flourish. It can range from big picture promises and wedding vows to a spouse, or to simply learning what kinds of things our friends like. Worshiping the Lord requires us to worship Him on His terms and conditions, not our own. We learn to love the Lord the way that He asked to be loved. God has requested to be honored a certain and specific way, and we ought to bring Him what He has asked for, and we should avoid bringing Him what He does not want. Thankfully, God never left His people in the dark. He not only powerfully revealed Himself, but also revealed how people should interact with Him, how they should approach Him, how they should worship. This is a large part of what the books of the law in the Old Testament explain. God gave the people the law, the Ark of the Covenant, and the tabernacle so that they would know how to approach Him again. He was giving them, as it were, a way back to the life in Eden. The tabernacle was thought to be a type of representation of God's heavenly reality. It was intended to mirror Eden, a place where God's presence inhabited and where God's people fully engaged in their worship and enjoyment of Him. Many scholars believe the tabernacle modeled the realities of Eden directly. There are all kinds of details that suggest that the tabernacle was a kind of Eden. These similarities are found in things like the eastward-facing entrances, protected by the cherubim, the use of gold, the representation of the tree of life through the lampstand, and the symbolic presence of the tree of knowledge in the form of the law. This is why God was so specific about the details of the tabernacle and later the temple. They were dim reflections of Eden, where worship began. As Israel continued to become established in the land and in God's promise, the time was coming for a localized place of worship. King David would one day seek an opportunity to build God's house. Prior to the kingdom of Israel, the tabernacle would constantly be reconstructed each time the people of Israel would move camp. The temple, however, would serve as a fixed place of worship within the city of Jerusalem, with the intention of having God's presence dwell within the capital city of God's people, an Eden of stone, harboring the presence of God. Although David was unable to construct the temple himself, he preserved the materials for his son Solomon to fulfill this divine task. Under Solomon's rule, Israel enjoyed an era of peace and prosperity, culminating in the construction of God's holy temple. Similar to Moses, Solomon received meticulous instructions from the Lord regarding every facet of the temple's construction. While we could delve into these intricate details and their lessons about God and worship, let's instead consider the underlying why behind these endeavors. Author Brian Dembowczyk writes, "The temple was where God met with His people. It was where God's people worshiped Him, and it was where the world caught a glimpse of who God is." We can often think of worship as a way of ascending to the presence of God, or the descending of God's presence to us, a push or pull kind of mentality about God's presence. But what the temple can teach us about worship is that God dwells. We don't worship to somehow attain His presence. Rather, we worship because of His presence. His presence has attained us. This distinctly takes the weight off of feeling in worship and teaches our souls to commune with God in a mature way that recognizes the truth that David wrote in the Psalms before. God is present always. The same David whose great desire was to construct the temple was the same David who recognized this mystery. God is present, full stop. His presence was tangibly manifested in the temple, but it was evident everywhere. And both should stir our hearts to worship Him. In the temple, God was creating a space where people could tangibly worship, where they could become ceremonially clean, sacrificed before God. But the temple itself was a kind of reflection, a hearkening back to Eden and the way that things should be. People freely and fully in God's presence without end. Consider what Adam and Eve's first commandment from God was. Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth. Subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. In other words, they were called to take Eden to the ends of the earth, to make the reality of unbroken communion with God the reality for everything, everywhere. The tabernacle and the temple both served the same purpose: to not only be places of wonder and worship where the presence of God dwelt, but to be a new kind of Eden, serving to draw the people of earth to the Lord. This is exactly what Solomon prayed in the dedication of the temple. He said, "In the future, foreigners who do not belong to your people Israel will hear of you. They will come from distant lands because of your name. For they will hear of your great name and your strong hand and your powerful arm. And when they pray toward this temple, then hear from heaven where you live and grant what they ask of you. In this way, all the people of the earth will come to know and fear you, just as your own people Israel do. They too will know that this temple I have built honors your name." N.T. Wright has a brilliant description of sin that can really help us here. He says, "Sin is not just doing things that God has forbidden. It is the failure to be fully functioning, God-reflecting human beings. Not simply breaking a few laws or crossing a few lines. No, you were designed to be something that you are not. That is sin. What disrupted Eden was that. It was people foregoing the responsibility to take the unbroken communion of the garden to the ends of all the earth, to enjoy and relish in the presence of God and to see it flourish everywhere." What the temple stood to represent was in part this original command and blessing: to be God's people and to worship in a way that draws people of earth to the presence of our God. Your worship of God has the same ability. Worship isn't purely experiential. It is also missional. It is a beacon of light and hope to the people of earth, communicating God's active presence among His people. It is an invitation to those far off to come and know and fear the Lord. Taste and see that the Lord is good. As theologian William Temple once wrote, "Worship is the submission of all our nature to God. It is the quickening of conscience by His holiness, the nourishment of the mind with His truth, the purifying of imagination by His beauty, the opening of the heart to His love, the surrender of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration, the most selfless emotion of which our nature is capable." This is what Eden accomplished. This is what the tabernacle was intended for. And this is what the temple stood to ignite in God's people and those who are far off. This, my friends, is what we are called to seek in God's presence.